Hello, all, and welcome to this session on showcasing research on your college applications. My name is Dr. GP Laborde, and I'm the head of strategic initiatives at Polygence and a longtime mentor here. And it's really my pleasure to welcome some really distinguished educational and admissions specialists here for a conversation today that will range not only from the specifics of how to feature research on your college applications. For many of you who have just completed your research projects and have presented them today, this will be highly useful, but also to really jump into the crazy world of college admissions writ large. There have been lots of changes in recent years, lots of nuances with the way students need to position themselves on their applications. And it's in times like these that the expertise of admission specialists can do so much for families, not only to improve applications for students, but also just to bring them some peace of mind. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. And I'd like to begin with Natalie Galindo-Lee, who's the founder of Sendero Education, an elite college consulting company. Natalie has 15 years of experience as an admissions officer at many top-ranked colleges, including Harvard, where she read more than 5,500 undergraduate applications during her time there. She holds a BA and Master's of Education from Harvard, as well as an MBA from UNC's Ken Flagler School of Business. And Natalie, we're just delighted to have you here today.
Thank you. I think you covered a lot of what I wanted to say, but it's okay. I'll go into kind of expanding on that. Did you want me to go into my background right now, or?
Yeah, let me introduce Tim, and then I'll kick it back to you, and we can jump into it. Also joining us is Timothy Hickey-Leclerc, who's the founder of Altitude Education Group, which helps students with admissions to the world's top universities. Tim has 12 years of experience in admissions with a specialty in STEM advising and storytelling, and he's personally reviewed more than 15,000 essays at schools like Brandeis, Johns Hopkins, the University of Michigan, and MIT, where he was most recently director of recruitment. And he also holds a BA in biology and philosophy from Williams College. Go Eafs, as a fellow Williams grad. I'm delighted to have you here for that reason too, Tim.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Natalie, I'll now give it back to you so you can go into a little bit more detail about your background and how you like to work with students.
Sure. So I like to start by saying that I'm not only a former admissions officer, right, and obviously at Harvard, but I'm also an immigrant to the US, and I was a student who had to go through the process myself with limited guidance. But I really benefited from a couple of people who really knew what they were doing. And so I know for a fact that I wouldn't have gone to Harvard if I hadn't gotten that support. So that's why if I work with you as a student, I bring my personal and professional backgrounds, which include 15 plus years of experience in admissions and higher ed. I've worked obviously at Harvard. I did graduate recruitment with UC Berkeley and NYU. I also have been in education technology companies, and one of them was Google Cloud. So I have kind of that technical business experience in addition, as you have heard with my MBA too. And along the way, what I ended up doing was also advising students, and because it's something that I really enjoy. I love the stories that come out of those conversations and seeing students reach really fantastic opportunities in schools. And actually, Tim and I met a couple of years ago, working at the same education college prep company. And last year, I actually launched Sendero to work exclusively with students. So I've worked with students throughout, but this has been kind of a full-time effort on my end for the last year. And it's been a lot of fun. I love it, and count on the support and mentorship of folks like Tim and others. But yeah, that's about me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure working with you, Natalie. I feel like, oh, sorry, GP. I just jumped right in. So I have worked, I think, one of the things about my kind of background is I've worked at a really broad range of institutions, from small liberal arts college to STEM-focused institutions like MIT to large state programs. So I've seen a wide variety of backgrounds. But I think similar to Natalie, I opened up my company full-time doing 100% advising in 2021 during the pandemic. And the reason for that is my last year at MIT, we saw a 66% increase in applications. And it meant that I alone evaluated about 11,000 applications in my final year, and we only admitted about 280 of them. But what I loved about MIT is that they had taken advice from all faculty. They basically asked them what qualities of students do well in your classes. Then they asked them to have identified top students in their programs to do interviews. And they used that to actually craft their admissions process and review. And they had 80 years worth of data on what sort of contributes to success for students long-term. And it was very data-driven. And I thought I would be so much better served, and the world would be so much better served using this information to prepare students, even if they don't go to MIT, for that long-term success. And that's ultimately what inspired me to start working with students. And I think I take a very different approach than a lot of other counselors. I don't give checklists. I often give a range of options for students based and tailored entirely to their interests, and put the ultimate decision on them and their family to decide which direction they want to go in, weighing the pros and cons. Because at the end of the day, I think my approach revolves around the idea of autonomy for students, of being interest driven. And I really try, I think, at the end of the day, to recognize that for students, your IQ is only 20% of your long-term predicted success. There are so many other personal qualities that contribute to that, including your curiosity, your discipline, your resilience. So I work with students not just on kind of telling a great story for the admissions office, but developing those qualities which are awfully hard to fake. And so I prefer working with students early on in the process, so that we have a little bit more time to kind of work on the development of those kinds of characters as well.
That's amazing advice for all. And I'm just going to drop into our chat a white paper that we've written on the power of resilience, and specifically how these kinds of student-driven projects can help to develop that muscle, which, as you say, it's just so key, not only to sustain students through the grueling college admissions prep and application process, but also just to prepare them for a gratifying life where they can meet obstacles and overcome them. So thank you so much for providing that point of entry too. I'd love to jump also into the sort of question at hand, which is, let's say a student has taken the initiative and found something that really sparks their interest, that sort of kindles that unique flame that they could bring to the world. They've found a mentor, they've worked at a lab, they've written something original, and they want to be able to feature that on their applications. Can you tell us how you help students to sort of identify and develop those kinds of projects? And then how do you help them frame that on their applications to the best effect?
Do you mind if I go ahead, Tim?
Yeah, take it away.
So what I'd say is that my approach is very much of trying to understand and recognize that this process is a really vulnerable experience for students and for families, right? And my goal in especially thinking about how to showcase their interests or their passions effectively is to identify a project, or whether it's research, whether it's a passion project specifically, really an initiative that is true to the individual student's values. If you are not really taking the time to understand yourself and build a really solid understanding of what is important to you. Some of you already know that. I know that there's several of you that are students that are really thinking about that very carefully. And yet it's a little difficult to navigate that thought process without a little bit of structure if you haven't already identified that. And regardless of where you fall, the idea is to make sure that you are developing something that's going to be kind of like a flagship initiative that you're going to be able to showcase in your application to highlight your brand or highlight your particular passions and interests. I really believe that if you do it right, it's something that would be really fulfilling, like personally fulfilling, and a growth opportunity, as opposed to something that is just another task to do, right? Because yes, it's going to be challenging, but what we know from, living the good life, I'm like a huge fan of positive psychology, is that if you are challenging yourself and reaching something that's a little bit harder, but like within your realm of possibility, then you're going to be better able to find self-satisfaction. And then ultimately that aligns really, really well with the college application process. That's actually why I love what Tim's saying about all of those qualitative factors in the process that make a really big difference in applications. Yeah.
I highly second Natalie's point about putting a lot of time and energy on the front end of the research process. I talk with a lot of students and they've started a project that they can barely even tell me anything about it. And they're actually in the process of conducting that research. That's not a very good sign. Like the more preparation and things that you put on the front end of a research project, the better, to help you figure out what areas are the most interesting. And interest can be defined in a lot of different ways. Is it a topic you find fascinating and you want to learn more about? Research is a great way to develop that area of expertise. Is it a project that you could use your research findings or whatever it is that's produced at the end of that process to make the world a better place? Are you driven by that desire to make an impact? And how would you do that? What would that look like? I talked to a student of mine recently who's quite young, and he's very interested in studying the comorbidity of Alzheimer's, schizophrenia and autism, which actually manifest as two different areas within the brain. And so sometimes when you look at them, they have a fairly similar overlap, but for a long time, people thought that they never occurred, that there was a zero overlap. But recent studies suggest that there might actually be a relationship for the two that we don't fully understand. But he couldn't tell me what schizophrenia was. He couldn't tell me how it was diagnosed. And so when you're conducting these research projects, you get what you put into it. And so you recognize that this isn't necessarily going to be a 2-hour per week commitment. The more time you put into the background, the better you'll be able to talk about it, the more you're going to learn, and the better your end results will be, because that background knowledge is going to give you the fundamental connections that are going to lead to more interesting questions and more interesting results. And in terms of kind of featuring it in the college application process, it's quite easy these days to get a mentor. Polygence makes it really easy and awesome and pretty affordable actually to find an expert who's going to help you understand the research process. So it isn't as much of a distinguishing feature as it used to be in the past. And so kind of going to Natalie's point, the more you kind of twist it into your existing responsibilities, interests, and passions, the better you'll be, because it tells a story about the things you love. At the end of the day, we have a million things we could spend our times doing, but there's 24 hours in the day. And the choices you make and how you use that time are what colleges are going to be looking into as a proxy for your values, your qualities, the things that you're interested in. And so you want those things to come across in the application, and your research project is an incredible way to do that. Letters of recommendation are really great. Ensuring that you actually develop a great relationship with your mentor. That's something that's a little bit outside your control once they write the letter, but you control the relationship leading up to that. So recognize that every interaction you have with your mentor, every assignment that you miss in your meetings is something that is contributing or not contributing to the quality of that letter. And I would say one thing too is that colleges are often interested not just in what you did for your research, they're interested in why you chose that, why you're interested in it, and what you learned or how you grew from that experience. And so personal statements, supplemental essays are incredible opportunities for you to reflect not just on what you did. I discovered this. Doesn't make for a very compelling essay, but I discovered this and I realized how it has changed my view of how everything in the world works is a much more interesting essay.
Absolutely. I wanted to add to that, Tim, because I feel like there's so many different ways that students miss steps on kind of ensuring that they have a solid foundation for the process, and then ultimately how they display it. You spoke about like this idea of not having much background knowledge. One of the first things we would have to do, we do, and I do with my students, is like, let's identify what are some of the foundational reading materials that you need to do. What are some of the foundation information that you need to have about this broader area of learning? And then let's dive more deeply into what is a question that really piques your interest, right? And when you're able to carry that through into execution in a research project, into putting that into your essays, into how you talk about it with your recommenders, it really comes across well in your application, right? What we like to say on the admission side was, we like to read applications that sparkle. And that's a very nebulous kind of quality in an application. But what it really speaks to is this level of enthusiasm, depth of knowledge, commitment, this level of this ability to share that knowledge and use that for positive impact. It's all part of what you're trying to convey in the application and in your story. So hopefully that's something that lights you up, right? And that comes across too.
Thank you both so much for these observations. There are definitely a few threads that I'd love to pull on too. Natalie, you mentioned the importance of positive psychology. And, I think, of course, of the work of not only Martin Seligman, but also of Carol Dweck and the fabled growth mindset that so many of us try to instill in young people. It brings to mind this amazing keynote speaker we had earlier today, Kelvin Doe, a prodigy inventor from humble beginnings in Sierra Leone, just finding ways of expanding his pool of resources with these sorts of positive interactions that he has had with people, to Tim's point. And that led him to amazing places from, again, that small place he grew up all over the world as a public speaker to MIT's Media Lab. You never know when one of those great interactions with a mentor will open a door for you. And so it's really important to come with enthusiasm, to come with authenticity and energy to make sure you're making the most of those opportunities. To Tim's point too, I wanted to note that, yes, it's true that research seems to have been something that's gaining notoriety for students in high school. And that's one of the reasons that Polygence was founded, is to provide students access, not just students who have connections at the R1 Research University that's next door, but kids from all over the world who have an idea or a passion that they want to dive deeper into. Tim also mentioned what economists call the opportunity cost of the things that we choose to do. What else might we be doing, and where could we be more productively spending our time? And we just find that when students are able to develop that skill set, that vocabulary that both of you were mentioning, the ability to speak intelligently in an informed way about the passion project or the research that you're doing, that is so easy to convey in conversation. And that's one of the reasons that we find, in addition to students featuring their research projects throughout their applications, as many as 5 different places, from essays to activities lists to letters of recommendation. But about a quarter of our students also use what they did in their projects as part of their conversation in their admissions interviews. And when I speak with young people, Tim, I find the same thing, that you can tell when someone's just sort of gone through the motions and has a vague recollection of the research they did, versus someone who's actually plunged their entire mind into this field, and they have more things to talk about and more field-specific words to share than there is time in the day. So I'm just sharing our admissions report that also includes some of those statistics about where students feature them in their applications. And as I do that, I wanted to invite both of you to maybe reflect on, was there a time with a student that you've worked with in your consulting business, or even during the time that you were reading applications at these great universities, was there a particular story of a student who just did amazing work that leaps out at you and that led to a really great result?
I feel like I've
been... Oh, sorry. Can I start now? Sorry. I worked with one student for 4 years, and he is a really interesting and engaging student who knows that he was very passionate about computer science. And so I encouraged him to think about a social challenge at which you can apply computer science, because computer science is now probably, I would say, the most competitive major at many schools. You look at a place like UIUC, which admits 50% of students overall, and their computer science department is admitting 5 or 6%. And so they're really looking for students who've done interesting things within the field that will kind of distinguish them. And he knew he wanted to do a research project. And so I gave him a couple of books on problems facing society. And he ended up picking The New Jim Crow, which is focusing on racial disparities in the social justice system in the United States. And he was so angry at what he read in the book, he wanted to do something about it. And he had recently read a report in an AI ethics kind of forum that police prediction softwares for crime prediction were disproportionately targeting Black and Hispanic families. And so he said, I can build a crime prediction model that is agnostic to race. And that's exactly what he did. He built one over the course of the summer, was not perfect, but he used that to reach out to a couple faculty members who were very impressed with the work he'd done. They gave him a lot of feedback. One actually at the University of Chicago offered to mentor him. And he ended up sending his project to a couple of different departments. And there is an organization called Safe Cities based in Toronto that actually convened a whole organizational meeting of mayors of Toronto area cities, of police chiefs. And he gave them a 1-hour presentation on his research and the problem of race being used as a factor unintentionally often, because the data that we use has a lot of bias baked into it because of sort of the human way that we collect that data. And he had a great time. And I think he's been able to make kind of a pretty big difference. He's now at MIT. Well, he got admitted to MIT this fall and plans to enroll. But I think it's something that he started early and he began searching for ways he could make a difference. And I think he's a really amazing example that a high school student can make a difference. I think one of the biggest things that I run into is that students will often say, well, I can't do that, or I can't email that person, or why would they want to work with me? Or I can't do that. I barely just did calculus. That student started working on that before he had even finished calculus. He had pre-calculus and basic computer science, and he learned these things using YouTube videos, tutorials, MIT open courseware. And he ended up doing something pretty awesome. So I think that for me is one of the most interesting examples.
Thank you. Natalie?
Sure. On my end, I think there's a couple of things. One, there's been times when I've seen that when I've worked with students that are already on the back end of that process, right, where they have already identified an area of interest, but they want to elevate it, right? And there was this one particular student who she's just an amazing school leader, and has been just really committed to DEI. But she herself had been struggling with managing personal challenges in terms of like mental health and things of the sort. And through her own research and her own process of self-reflection, she was able to understand that like part of the challenges that she was facing was an addiction to technology, to mobile phone, right? And that led into this pathway of doing this amazing research, evaluating not just how to improve herself, right? So she learned to create boundaries in technology. She ended up even going to experience a retreat that was like no tech retreat, right? Having that in personal experience, but then transitioning to doing a paper that focused on like mental health, on technology, how to help teens address this challenge that can get very much, can really distract from the potential opportunities that they have and really their developmental growth. And ended up submitting it to a Symposium where she didn't say she was a high school student. She was the only high school student selected to present. So it was a really extraordinary kind of situation. And I'm so incredibly proud of her because she really brought something very personal, right? When she wrote about it in her application, it was very, very easy to see her why and the personal meaning, but also the fact that she was a school leader translated to actions that she took as a leader, right? So the research fed her impact. She brought in new initiatives to the way that her school interacted with faculty and with students. And so when she talked about it in her application, it was a full surround demonstration of passion. She got recently this fall a full scholarship to Vanderbilt because that was her top choice. One of her top choices. She actually wanted to also go to UT Plan 2 as her top choice, and that's where she sat now. That's where she was admitted as well. So she has these two amazing options that she's exploring and pursuing, and waiting for a few more decisions nowadays. But that to me was just such an amazing kind of trajectory to see her grow overall. I'd also say that as I work with students who are on the earlier side of the process right now, for me, it really centers on what we were talking about before, really trying to be creative and having exposure to other ways to tie in information that might be unexpected, right? What I love about Tim's example is that when a student creates a project, right, that is technically oriented, it may not always address a social issue. It may not always center on the social challenges that students are facing. And that's what we try to do in our conversations.
Yes, this is exactly the point that I wanted to highlight for all of our listeners right now, is that there are so many ways of finding a niche for your passion project or for your research. And some of those are very specific and applied, and that's obviously great. But one of the themes that we can draw from these student stories, just from the two of you, and something that we also see very often in the way that our students approach the work that they're doing, is using that specific interest, whether it be subject matter related to student mental health, or whether it be the application of AI technology to different fields. By virtue of focusing on communities of need, or how they could give back to their local community or society on the whole, it really shows the kind of student that I know so many of these elite colleges are looking for. There are highly qualified people all over the world, but those students who have a predisposition to giving back or to improving the places where they are, that just means that the campus is going to be better for having them. And I could imagine if I were sitting in your shoes back in the days in the admissions offices, that would be the kind of student I would love to invite to campus. So congratulations, Tim, to your student at MIT, and Natalie to your student who may be at Vanderbilt. If she goes there, I want to recommend the classes of a friend, Andy Van Schack, who is a really experienced professor in cognitive psychology. He is also a hoot. So really, really would be fun to take a class with him, I'm sure.
I'll work with you about that, JP.
Excellent, excellent. So it's at this time that I want to invite all of our participants to ask your burning questions. You can feel free to enter them in the Q&A, but we have these amazing experts here who are available to answer your specific curiosities and concerns about the college admissions process. So please, as I say, enter those questions into the Q&A. And to move us sort of in that direction, because I know that it can be very easy to forget that there are thousands of great schools in the US, and that families tend to fixate on the top 50 or top 25 or even just the top 13 or so. We know that from recent reporting on this crazy college admission season, there are about 2 million applications to the top 67 most competitive schools in the country. And of that, about 415,000 have applied to Ivies this year. So really just numbers that continue in part to be inflated by test optional policies in some places, but also just speaking to, I think, broad enthusiasm to go to these most competitive schools. Can you tell us, what do you think accounts for that concentration of interest in just these top schools? And how do you, knowing that you're working with families of highly successful and motivated young people, how can you prepare them for that journey, knowing that there are no guarantees, even if they are just superstars within their own fields?
I would say it's really tough because at the end of the day, every school is completely different. And so I think the hardest part for people to realize is that on paper, schools might look very similar, but behind the scenes, they have constructed admissions processes that reflect their values, their priorities, and their vision for the future. And those can vary even a little bit from institution to institution, or a lot. But even if the changes are relatively minimal, you could take an absolutely amazing student, put them through the process at multiple schools, and the outcomes will be different, in part because those schools are looking for and valuing things that are different in the process. When I worked at Williams, we would often focus very, very heavily on the quality of writing in a personal statement and their verbal score, because regardless of what you do, you're going to be probably writing at least 20 pages a week, even as a science major, because communication, written and verbal, is something that is highly emphasized in the education. At MIT, we routinely admitted students with 2s and below on the AP English exams. So it's very different processes, and the things that make you competitive in one school might actually hurt you a little bit in another process. But you can't really worry about that. And so what I tell students is that at the end of the day, it isn't the school that makes you good or great, that all colleges are aggregators of opportunity, that they're there to empower you and shepherd you to the next stage of your journey. And that you can be successful at any institution. In fact, if you look at the vast majority of Fortune 500 CEOs, there's actually almost an equal number of people who didn't graduate college as who did. And a very small percentage of those actually went to the top universities. And it always strikes me that the most successful people sometimes worry that they won't be successful if they don't have certain things, but it's really the connections you make, how you utilize your summers, getting the preparation curricularly that you need for the next stage of your journey, that is going to kind of make you successful. And I have a really great example of this. When I was first starting out with advising, I was working with 2 students. They were both very, very obsessed with the University of Chicago. They loved the intellectual vitality. They loved the core curriculum. One of them was a little bit anxious, and I thought would maybe not be the best fit with that sort of competitive, very high stress environment. They have grading curves that can be tough for students. And the other student I thought would be a perfect fit. And unfortunately, while they both applied early decision, the first student was admitted and the second student was denied. And so that first student went to the University of Chicago, actually was not a great fit for him. He ended up taking a year off. He graduated in 5.5 years instead of 4 years. The second student ended up going to Brandeis University on a scholarship, where she graduated with high honors and is now doing a dual PhD MD at Harvard Medical School. And so at the end of the day, it's the student that makes the trajectory. Would she have been successful at University of Chicago? I'm sure, absolutely. But she was equally, if not more successful at Brandeis. And so it's not about where you end up, it's what you do with the opportunity and the mindset you maintain while you're there.
I think 100%. For me, what I think is really important as part of this process is that you as a student feel seen, encouraged, heard, and supported in recognizing like your own strengths, right? Your own areas of possibilities for contributing. Because when it comes to these, top institutions, like Tan said, they're not every school is the right fit for every single student. And the work that we do together is try to identify that. But B, if you walk into this process with an approach where it's going to, a particular school is just the end all be all, and there's no recognition that there's a lot of potential really great options for you, and you can be successful in your own right, regardless of the path that you take, then that's where the process can become really oppressive, really challenging, really destabilizing personally, right? So I center on that as a really important aspect of my approach, working with students. And then also thinking strategically, right? For when these colleges are competitive. And so what we can do is also think about what are things that you care about, that you're excited about, that are also strategically aligned with what the universities are looking for. As Tim said, there's different needs that universities have. The admissions process is more about what the universities need than about you specifically, and at the beginning of the process. And so when you recognize that, and you have a particular aim for the school or the type of school that you're looking to reach, developing your profile, your brand, if you will, accordingly is going to ultimately benefit you as well. And so that when you're translating from your activities to your essays and your application, it displays really effectively. And to me, the pitfall happens when you don't connect all of those dots, right? I've had a student where he applied early to Stanford. I wasn't working with him until later on in the process, and had an amazing outcome in in technology. He had creating his own company. He even had a chance to like intern at Apple, right? Had some amazing outcomes technically, and he put together an application narrative that was really, really unfortunate for his application, so that when he applied early to Stanford, he didn't make it. But when we worked on it together and understood, okay, these are some of the aspects of the way that you're displaying yourself that are problematic and would be concerning from an admissions standpoint, that you would want to adjust and make sure aligns with what the university is actually looking to hear about you. I feel like a lot of students end up wanting to come across as either having a tragic narrative or having a particular experience that is very difficult or trying to come across as so hard charging that they lose their personality or humanity, right? And so what we want to do in the process is to ensure that you're displaying that aspect really, really well, so that when the application and the admissions officers are reading it, they understand who you are as a human, like what you're going to be like as a classmate, a friend, an alum, right? And who you are as somebody who's invested in kind of contributing to the community, right? Those two things are really critical when you're thinking about developing your applications and your entire profile, especially for these top schools.
Of course. Yes, thank you both for those stories. We're beginning to get some good questions in the Q&A, so keep them coming, please. But I also want to draw out one of the through lines, I think, from both of your stories, particularly Tim's, that might be highly relevant for families. We know that many students who are applying to these top schools probably have designs on going to graduate school and getting a professional degree, whether that be in an applied field, so getting an MA, or maybe it's in a professional field like medicine or business or law. And in those situations, it can be that going to the school that offers you greater financial aid sets you up for a better application where you are a distinguished undergraduate than the top school where you might be one of many highly competitive applicants to graduate school. Can you tell us how you approach that conversation with families? Should they be thinking about the next step after college as well? You know, if they know that they want to be a physician, to have that sort of be baked into the college list that they're creating?
From my mind, I think it's something that's really important to keep in mind. Of course, you have to keep an open mind that college is going to bring an entirely new experience, that you might be exposed to something completely different and decide to change your mind. But regardless, if you already have a vision of what you want to accomplish after college, that should be a part of the decision-making process, both in terms of the brand that you take, how competitive that particular pathway might be at a particular university for undergrad purposes in particular, and then what you would want to do in college to ensure that you're setting yourself up for success afterward. What do I mean by that? When it comes to students who want to pursue medical school, right? There's as much value in not just identifying colleges that will kind of be a balance of not being so competitive within the college to discourage you from pursuing that path, because there's many stories at Harvard, for example, where students who would want to go with this really big desire of going into medical school, and just the experience of the competition at Harvard was particularly challenging, where they may have been better served with a slightly different institution and continued in their pathway and success to actually go on to medical school. There are some of those scenarios. If you want to actually kind of continue on that particular pathway, it may be better for you to, first of all, in the application process, not commit yourself 100% to being exclusively someone who's focused on biology or being a researcher in sciences. Try to incorporate some also social science components in your application, because that is something that colleges want to see, especially a liberal arts college, if that's the pathway that you're interested in, for example. And then when it comes to college, to the medical pathway, if you end up pursuing, we know that from an admission standpoint to medical schools, the students who focus on the social sciences actually have a slightly higher admission rate to medical schools than students who focus exclusively on a major that's in the medical sciences, like biology or things of the sort. So you want to be thoughtful about that entire process along the way when you're thinking about your overall pathway, and how that grounds you, or how that ought to ground you in the approach that we take in the actual college selection process, is that you identify schools that have a higher success at placing students at the particular type of medical institution that you're in, the medical program that you're looking to attend.
Right, great point.
Or that you are really thinking about what are some of the additional options that you have on the table for financial aid purposes, if you want to try to plan yourself out financially effectively, if I'm making any sense.
Yes, thank you. Tim, insights here?
I would say that I unabashedly chose the money every single time during my own college process. I went to Williams College because it only cost my parents $2,500 a year to go. I was admitted to Harvard, Stanford, University of Pennsylvania, and University of Michigan for my master's. And I went to Michigan because they offered me a full scholarship. So for me, I think finances are a huge part of that. And I've been able to do a lot of what I love and what I'm passionate about after graduating, in part because I haven't had to be burdened by loans. And I think for a lot of families in the journey, they are surprised to learn that often going to more selective, more competitive institutions can actually make it more difficult to go to top graduate programs. And if you think about it, Harvard Medical School does not want to fill the entire Harvard Medical School class with Harvard and Yale graduates. And in fact, if you are a top student in a university that is not as well known and not as competitive, your chances of being admitted to some of these programs are quite high. Is the same conversation I have around families who are trying to decide between private high schools and between public high schools. And oftentimes, many of the students I work with that attend a private high school with really great backgrounds will not be admitted to the schools that are at the top of those piles. And had they had that same profile at a public school, they probably would have been. And the reason for that is these programs, both at the undergrad and graduate level, are looking for diversity of people, diversity of institutions, diversity of backgrounds. And so just like the student I talked about before, being a really top student at Brandeis is a great way to kind of stand out in the process. And many institutions will actually give you a lot more hands-on attention. So students will often say, I have to go to the University of Michigan where I did my master's. Amazing school. I love it. Great opportunities. Their biology department has something like 100 faculty members. They have every specialization you could think of. But as an undergrad, you're probably not going to be in contact for a research project with those faculty until maybe junior year. If you're really ambitious and you push pretty hard, you may find one earlier. My professor, after my first class at Williams College, asked me if I wanted to do research with them. And so think about kind of what are the skill sets that contribute to success simultaneously as well in graduate programs. Often it's written and verbal communication skills, critical thinking, curricular preparation, and experience. And so the opportunities that are going to give you those experiences. And I think one kind of misunderstanding is that if you want to do a physics PhD, you must have done tons of research in the exact niche area you want to do that PhD in. That is not true. You need research experience, familiarity, and a really strong, solid foundation in physics. But you could have done research on an entirely different subject area and still be quite competitive for those, so long as you've got that experience under your belt. So you might not have the specificity at a smaller school, but you may gain access to that research and at a higher level earlier on. So think about the pros and cons, and not only kind of what is the financial burden that you'll be incurring later on and how to kind of spread that out, but how can you begin to build just the skill sets and the knowledge base that you would need for those as well.
There was one more thing I wanted to add, if you don't mind me adding. When you're thinking about graduate school, I think that's really critical. If you're also thinking about particular professional paths, you obviously want to be mindful of that too. So for example, if you're going in a finance direction and you want to go into the consulting world at top tier institutions, that's when you also want to understand what the pathways ultimately end up being for that end goal, right? You will know that, top consulting companies are more often than not recruiting at top institutions. And that's when you want to aim for those institutions at a higher level. So it really depends on the path that you're ultimately wanting to take, right? If you want to work at a top tech company, a blue chip company, then Google actually hires more students out of San Jose State University than it does from some of the top schools, right? So just recognize that there are just different pathways that you want to think about specific to your own interests and your own overall long-term trajectory, and being conscientious about that at the early stages of the college prep process is going to equip you more effectively to succeed in that.
Thank you so much. I would be remiss here with all of this great conversation about strategic planning and pathways if I did not mention that Polygence really cares about arming and equipping students to make these kinds of long-looking decisions by offering a program like Pathfinders, which is our opportunity to speak with different mentors in 3 different fields. So you can figure out how that person became a management consultant. Why did they choose to major in what they majored in? What did they focus on? And then move over to the person who is now in law or now in computer science. Thank you both so much. For me personally, this has been the most edifying part of the panel so far, and we still have 15 minutes left. So with that, I want to move into some of the audience questions. And we'll see if we can pick these off relatively quickly so that other folks can also get their questions in as well. The first question was related to some of the projects we discussed at the beginning, and the attendee said the examples you're giving are very encouraging, but what about projects that are not in the vogue? So let's say non-AI projects or non-neuroscience projects. How do you showcase them? What would your advice be there?
I would say the same way, and those projects are, in fact, they stand out a little bit more on the admissions side, partly because I remember there's a very amazing high school in Virginia called Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, and they offered a computer vision course for the first time during my second year, I think, at MIT. And every single student from that school had a computer vision project that year. And by the end of it, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't want to hear about computer vision ever again. And then one student was doing a project on concrete. And I still remember that research because she was studying a technique from ancient Romans where they mix seawater with the lime. And no one could figure out why, but this concrete is actually longer lasting than the concrete we make now, and it has the ability to actually self-repair in some instances. And so she was looking at this style of self-repair in concrete, and she was so enthusiastic about concrete that I couldn't help but fall in love with the application. Because since when do you hear someone talk so romantically about concrete? And so I think there's been a lot of projects, and I think, in fact, like doing something that you find generally interesting that other folks do not can be a really amazing way to stand out. I have a student that I worked with for a few years who really liked praying mantises, and he bred them at home, he raised them. He ended up doing a research project on different hunting strategies that were employed by different species or genuses of praying mantises. And he had some really great college options. And I think part of that is when you do something you really love that is particularly unusual, it is often easier to stand out than if you're doing a hot project. Because if you're doing a hot project, you have to be doing a very, very unusual application. You have to be one of the best for that to really kind of resonate at a high level in the process. If you're doing an AI project half-heartedly, probably not gonna do too much for you.
And I actually find that standing out, just to echo that, standing out in the more common trajectories is very difficult. And I would say that it's actually a lot more convincing, especially if you're able to meld unexpected topics in a creative way. So if you really love cryptography, then you are interested in material science as well, or you love music, maybe thinking about a project that focuses on research just to combine the music side of the material science, so I don't overcomplicate myself. You have a project that studies the materials in musical instruments and how they impact the way they sound. That is cool. Like, think about that as an admissions officer. If you're reading something about tons and tons of applications, how would you see the project that is being read on the other side, right? And it doesn't have to be cool to a lot of people. It has to be cool to you. And in that, if you're able to showcase that passion, it really lights up the person who's reading it on the other end.
I love these stories, so thank you both for sharing those. And Natalie, to your point, one of the student I would like to call out today for a wonderful presentation in the AI applications. So this is an in vogue subject matter, but I believe his name was Kunal, was talking about, and he spoke very poetically about at the beginning about how music was actually his passion. So his project was all about using artificial intelligence to create different levels of emotional tension by emphasizing different intervals in between musical notes according to rhythm. So a super unique way of applying AI that I think would probably stand out. And Tim, to your point, I'll do my best to avoid puns about the subject matter being dry, but I also have my own concrete story that, to your point, just sticks out with me. During my Fulbright in Switzerland, one of my great friends, Carl, who was already working as an architect. He did a Princeton undergrad and a master's at Stanford, but his Fulbright project was on self-healing concrete. And in addition to mixing unreacted concrete into the molds that they would pour for bridges and so forth, there were also steel pins within them. And so the friction created by those pins interlocking within this concrete, if there was a crack, water would get in, activate the unreacted concrete, and help the bridge, as you mentioned, self-heal in effect. And that's just so unique. And this friend was able to speak about it with such passion. It seemed like it was, revealing some sort of truth for him about the way that the universe works. When you can speak with passion about something that is unique like that, I'm sure that it stands out for admissions officers in exactly the same way that that story stands out for me. Thanks to both of you for that. Let's move on to another question in the 8 minutes we have remaining. I'm going to do my best to combine these two, but as you might imagine, families are interested. What do top colleges look for? How do they evaluate courses taken? How does college credit work? Transferring APs or community college classes in terms of graduating early. If you had to come up with some high-level answers to how admissions officers try to evaluate strength of curriculum and how they think about allowing students to apply these credits to their undergraduate curricula, what is the advice that you would give to these families?
Yeah, we could teach an entire class on some of this stuff, but I think at a high level, what I would say on the academic front, it really, at a baseline, needs to be about exhausting as much as possible the academic options at your disposal, whatever they might be, and then doing really well in those. If you are not already in that category, it's going to be much, 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 much harder to have access to the top institutions. From there, it really is about what are some of the courses that are going to be better understood on the admissions front, right? So for what it's worth, some people love APs, some people don't love APs, or the IBs, or the kind of exams that are associated with that. If there is something that offers a more standardized way of understanding your performance in that particular course, such as the AP exam, then it's probably in your benefit to pursue that, and obviously to do well, right? If you're not going to get on the top, it's going to be harder. But that would be kind of the most basic answer that I would provide in terms of thinking about optimizing your curriculum.
Yeah, I think the unsatisfying answer to this question is every single college is different. And that is true. There are subtle to dramatic differences in what schools are looking for. For example, MIT and Caltech are not going to be looking for the same thing as Vanderbilt, Williams, or Columbia. But I think at the end of the day, in terms of preserving options, I think the idea of maximizing curriculum is a good one. And in general, there's 5 core subjects that you should really be prioritizing. That is English, a foreign language, a social science, a natural science, and mathematics. And the higher the school, the more they are expecting you to have maxed out each of those 5 core areas. I think that there's can be some flexibility. For example, if you don't take AP Spanish and instead you take a couple of extra social science APs, that's fine. But even a school like Stanford, for example, if you're applying as an English major, they will kind of like to see some APs in STEM because it is a liberal arts institution at heart, and they want to see maximization across the board. In terms of transferring credits, every school is different, and a general rule of thumb is the more selective the school, the less you're going to get. So that's kind of my advice in that area. But the way that I like to kind of think about the applications to the most selective programs is that it's kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the base, you have academics, and that is the foundation that everything else is built on. You need strong academic performance across GPA, how well you've done kind of in comparison to your peers, the rigor of your courses, and then testing. And we're seeing that the tests are coming back at a lot of the top universities in the US. So those are pretty important. And I'd lump AP scores or IB scores or A levels in that grouping. And then built on top of that is going to be your extracurricular performance. And then on top of that is going to be your qualities. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be awfully hard to get into a top school without an academic profile that the rest of this can rest on. If you've got lots of C's, it's not going to happen for you. But just having that academic performance is also not enough for you to get into the top programs. They're looking for a diversity of perspective, experience, or skill sets that you're bringing as evidenced through what people say about your presence in the classroom and through what you've done extracurricularly.
Great advice. My efforts to sort of summarize, we have only 3 minutes left, and as is typical, when you have brilliant people speaking, you just would love to go on speaking with them, but we're going to do our best to end on time. So as we approach maybe the last 1 or 2 answers, I also wanted to share this form that I've just shared in the chat. And it is an invitation to basically follow up with our experts, either directly via email or in small group discussions. So if this is something you're interested in, having further discussions, providing feedback to our experts on the sorts of things that you want to have them speak about more, feel free to enter your name there and we can reach out to coordinate that meeting. I'd love to, there's a good question from an anonymous attendee. And this is, of course, as you mentioned, Natalie, the stuff of entire hour-long conversations on its own, books are written about it and so forth. So I'm really putting you on the spot here. But a student asks, what would be your top priorities for a checklist for choosing school for undergrad? And I would say, if you could limit these to maybe your top 3 ideas very briefly, because I have one more important question for you right after this, okay? So let me serve that up for you. Top 3 priorities that you like to share with students when they're building their undergrad college lists.
Well, it's a tricky question because to me, it's really very personalized. It really starts from, I would say, understanding what helps you thrive, right? What kind of academic environment helps you thrive? And that's as much the physical environment to the educational format of the environment. So that's one. Second is, of course, ensuring that you have different levels of, admissibility, right? Of competition that you might have in order to be able to get into that school. And then third, and still rather important, is thinking about how you're hoping to use your college experience in the long run, right? What we were talking about earlier, graduate school, professional pathways. Those are the top 3 things that I would think about with no additional information about the individual student. I think it's critical for me to think about the individual first.
Yeah, I totally second that. Some shorthand things that I would kind of recommend would be kind of thinking about size of institution. So if you are a resident of the state of California, you are blessed to have very affordable access to some of the best public schools in the country. But at the end of the day, schools like University of Michigan, UC Berkeley, some of your intro classes could be 500 to 750 students in some cases. If you're an out-of-state student and paying $75,000 a year out-of-state tuition to attend one of those places, is that going to be the best use of that $75,000? And I think oftentimes private, smaller schools with kind of great small classes, access to research opportunities might actually be better to consider. So don't just be wowed by the name of this institution, because often that's tied to things like PhD success, the quality of their sports teams, and not as much about the quality of the actual education you'd have in the classroom itself there. I also tell students to sort of think about what major you are interested in pursuing. And I cannot tell you how many times I've talked to a student who says, I want engineering, I've got to go to Yale or Harvard. If you want engineering, those are probably not the best institutions for you to go. They're obviously going to be solid programs because everything at those schools are great, but where the cutting edge engineering is happening is often not those places. So think about what it is you want to study and then put some time and energy into looking at those. And then I would say for the third thing, probably look a little bit more deeply at kind of how the major and how the curriculum is taught at those institutions. You have schools with strict core curriculums and schools with completely open curriculums, schools with majors that are 11 classes and schools with majors that are 19 classes. And there's a huge variety of everything in between those. So what do those things accomplish for you, and what kind? Are you looking for a passing general major, or are you looking for a real bachelor's of science with a really well-established curriculum? Those things matter because they often affect your chances of being admitted for professional programs or being hired immediately after graduation.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to put you on the spot. We're 1 minute over, so we have to make sure to end very quickly. I know that growing up, I would have loved a program like Polygence. Growing up in rural Maine, to connect with someone to show me the horizon of possibility would have been thrilling. Some students still are able to do their own passion projects. And so I wanted to ask you, did either of you do a research or passion project in high school? And if you did, what was it? If you didn't, and you had the chance to do a project or even work with a Polygence mentor, what would that project be on, I wonder?
That I didn't have the option. It was something that I came to the US so late in the game to some extent that it was understanding this process, let alone getting to a research opportunity in high school, was really unfathomable. But I did the most with what I had around me. And I think that that's what ultimately led to my opportunities. What I'd say is, once I did it in college, I wrote a thesis in college and I loved the research experience. I ended up studying citizenship and culture in Latin American context. And I know that based on the interest that I had in high school, I would have probably dove straight into Latin American literature. I loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez with a passion. And there's so many different elements that you can bring into understanding society and Latin American society through a literature lens. That's just very different than what you see in English literature. That's probably what I would have focused on. I still love them so much.
Lovely.
I just actually got Nos Vemos en Agosto. It just dropped at my house yesterday. So in the high school, same story for me. I went to a tiny Catholic school where I was one of 45 in the graduating class. Neither of my parents went to college. Was not something that was even remotely on my radar. But I am a real plant nerd. You can kind of see I have lots of tattoos of plants. And so I most definitely would have done something. And one of the things that I've always been fascinated by is the ways in which insects and plants drive the other's evolution. And so I probably would have looked at something related to the Red Queen hypothesis between kind of plant species and insect species that are devouring the leaves and the parts of the plant. What that would look like, I don't know.
Fascinating, Tim. Thank you both so much. As I say, I would love to continue this conversation with you right now, but we need to wrap this up, both for our presenters and also for the concluding address from our co-founder, Janos. So with that, I just want to offer one more round of thanks to both of you for your expertise, for your stories. If you're interested in following up with these experts, then please do fill out that form that's in the chat. And please enjoy the concluding remarks from Janos to start in just a few minutes back in the lobby. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.